Welcome to today's session, Microsoft Fabric and Azure DevOps, the story so far, where apparently someone's just told me they're looking forward to a Fabric introduction, which is going to be very short for you all. Anyway, so let's clicker is on my side here. So to manage expectations, everybody, for today's session, demos will be shown. It's all on a trial tenant. There's no NDA material. And it does include details about the new Microsoft CI/CD workflows document. Now, just to check, can somebody just confirm you can see my slides okay? I forgot to ask just now. Good. Right, so here's the agenda for today's session. I do my obligatory bio, then an introduction to Microsoft Fabric, like I just mentioned. Then I'll do an introduction to Azure DevOps for you all. Then I'll go through configuring Azure DevOps for Git integration. And then using Azure DevOps with the new-ish suggested CI/CD workflow options. Then we'll go through some alternative way to do CI/CD for Microsoft Fabric data warehouses, where, as I explained to some people earlier, you will get to see some T-SQL. So, a bit about myself quickly before you get started. My name is Kevin Chant. I'm a data engineering manager living in the Netherlands. However, as some of you can probably tell from the accent, I'm actually originally from the southwest of the UK. However, I live in the Netherlands due to the fact my wife is Dutch. So basically, I'm an Englishman, living in the Netherlands, working for a large international consultancy because he met a woman in Australia. Now, if you kept up with that, you're definitely in a good place for this session. So I've worked in IT for quite some time. Over the years, I've worked in various sectors, including the banking, oil, and health insurance industries. I've gained various certifications over the years, including the Fabric Analytics Engineer certification and the DevOps certification, both of which are quite relevant for this session. I'm also a Microsoft Certified Trainer and Microsoft Data Platform MVP. And you can find me online in a number of places. I'm on Twitter and Blue Sky is at Kev Chant. I'm also on the Mastodon server if you can find me. LinkedIn's got a nice user-friendly URL. You can find my blog where I post a lot about data platform and developer technologies. A lot of the content in this session you can find in some of my blog posts and a lot more deeper details. So if you are interested, if this does pique your interest, you can look afterwards. And I have my own GitHub site as well, where I share a lot of repositories that you can download and use as templates to perform things like CI/CD for SQL Server databases, Azure Synapse dedicated SQL pools, etc., etc. In addition to all of that, I am an organizer of another online conference and also one of the organizers for the Dutch Fabric user group. Right, now that's out of the way, let's go through Fabric. So I'm sure by now, the majority of you have seen a variation of this diagram before, which represents the Microsoft Fabric architecture. At the top of the screen, you have the 4 pillars which Microsoft Fabric are based on. So basically, it's a comprehensive analytics platform. So you go to one website and everything's available at your fingertips. It's lake-centric and open because you can store all of your files and all of your nicely curated Delta tables in a unified storage solution. Potentially, preferably, I should say, in the same format. There are some exceptions to this. For example, in real-time intelligence, you actually save to a KQL database first. So it empowers every business user because you can use tools that are familiar to you to work with Fabric. For example, Power BI Desktop, which I show in this session. And in addition to that, if you go to the digital launch video from last year for when Fabric was first announced, you will see a really good demo on there showing Microsoft PowerPoint. And finally, it's AI powered because, as I'm sure most of you have heard by now, there are multiple Copilot experiences throughout Fabric, in addition to some other things that help with AI now as well, including AI skills. Now, when working with Microsoft Fabric, I tend to recommend 2 different groups of services as well, which includes Microsoft Purview for your compliance and governance needs. By the way, just in case anybody's missed it, there is a new Purview portal, I should say, available now. that combines them both together. So you can go through both your compliance and governance aspects there. Has some nice new features as well, by the way. And also either Azure DevOps or GitHub for your lifecycle management needs. So as I mentioned, Microsoft Fabric has a unified storage solution, and that's called OneLake. And you can think of OneLake a bit like OneDrive because it's a layer of abstraction over multiple Azure Data Lake storage accounts. But you don't have to worry about any of those. You just deal with this nice front-end looking OneLake. Then you can put all your files in there, you can create all your tables in there, etc. So I'll quickly go through the workloads for you all now. So you have Data Factory, and this is where you orchestrate your data movement within Microsoft Fabric using your data pipelines, which is similar to Azure Data Factory pipelines and Synapse pipelines, or Data Flows Gen 2, which is based on Power Query. Then we have Power BI, which is the same as before, only not because of lots of innovations and optimizations. For example, the new direct lake mode. The reality is that Microsoft Fabric is based on the Power BI architecture. So if you have a Power BI background, you're going to thrive in Fabric. Next, we have Data Activator, and this can generate alerts based on data that is being ingested either through real-time intelligence or from Power BI reports. When I talk about this to people, I tend to explain as data-driven plus. Next, and I did say this was a short and sweet introduction, everybody. Next, we have industry solutions. This is where you can deploy various templates of solutions that you can use for various things, such as for working with manufacturing data, retail, healthcare, or sustainability. So I deliberately said sustainability last because those of you who are required to work with CSRD data over the next couple of years can look at the ESG data estate capability that's part of this workload. Then we have data engineering. This is where you can work with the Lakehouse paradigm at scale. You store the data as either any type of files or nicely curated Delta tables. And then you can manipulate the code various ways, including notebooks that are backed by Spark Compute. This is very similar to other services you may have used like Databricks, Synapse Spark, etc. Then we have Data Warehouse. This is the one that most people here will be the most keen on because this allows you to use T-SQL to work with large amounts of data at scale. So those of you who have worked with, for example, Synapse SQL pools or Azure SQL Data Warehouse, this is a similar kind of experience. Then we have real-time intelligence, formerly known as real-time analytics, and this allows you to ingest streaming data at scale. And you tend to do this through something called event streams, which is a nice GUI-based way to configure streaming data. Just to highlight things for everybody though, if you are working with data engineering experience, you can actually still work with streaming tables in there as well. Just thought I'd give that a little bit of a tip there. And then finally, we have data science. This one is actually pretty good. This allows all your data scientists to work together, collaborate and share notebooks, experiments and models, all within a Microsoft Fabric workspace. So I think it's quite interesting. It's got a few nice stuff thrown into it. So yeah, it is worth looking into. So the idea of Microsoft Fabric is that it removes a lot of friction because all of those workloads I just covered can work together. So whereas in the past, you had to put all the plumbing together to work with all these services, and as I know, at least one of my moderator knows, you can sometimes get some interesting network surprises. The premise is now that you can do it all within Microsoft Fabric. Of course, you can still work with other services as well in reality, but this is the premise. Now, I will very quickly show you all how Microsoft Fabric looks, and this will probably be one of the shortest demos of Fabric you will see. So let me F11 on that, give you some more screen space. So this is Microsoft Fabric when you first go into it. These are all the workloads that I quickly covered just now. And in fact, if I click on settings on the top right-hand corner and go down the admin portal, those of you who have a Power BI background will realize this is the same admin portal you worked with in the past with Power BI. And in addition to that, and I'll close some of this off here, as you can see, actually the left-hand side has come to life as well with a few various different things you can do. Now I can still select to choose the separate workloads in the bottom left-hand corner here. I can choose workspaces just like you've done over the years in Power BI. So for example, if I click on this particular one here, you can see I've got various objects in this workspace. I can click on new item if I want, quickly work with any Fabric items. By the way, bit of advice, if you don't see a lot of Fabric items here, just Power BI related ones, the chances are you haven't got your capacity set up properly for that workspace or potential licensing issue. Anyway, after you've created one of these objects, it's very easy to open them. You just click on any of them like so, and that's it. Anyway, everybody, that is, and I did tell you all this, a very short introduction to Microsoft Fabric. So now I'm going to go through Azure DevOps. So Azure DevOps manages your application lifecycle management all the way from creating an initial work item to doing the actual release. In reality, Azure DevOps is a collection of services. And when you deploy a new, what's known as a project in Azure DevOps, you can usually see these default services there. And I'll show you this shortly. And this is extensible as well. You can actually add other services from the marketplace, etc. Now, there's two main versions of Azure DevOps. There's Azure DevOps Services, which is the cloud-based version. And there's Azure DevOps Server, which is a server you can install on premises. And the reason I mention that in this session is because at this moment in time, Microsoft Fabric Git integration only supports Azure DevOps Services. So in other words, it only supports repositories in the cloud-based version. And I'm going to quickly go through Azure DevOps for you all now. My tab stops going rogue. So bear with me, everybody. I will make this nice and quick here. Right. So this is Azure DevOps when you first go into it, and I will get you some more landscape here. At the top, you have a little icon. This represents the account you're logged into Azure DevOps as, plus the tenant as well for that particular account, because that can influence the organizations you have access to. On the left-hand side below the icon are the organizations that account has access to. Now, these organizations can be the company you work for, or if you work for a large enterprise, it can be just a domain within that enterprise, or one you've created for testing purposes. Now, one thing I will highlight, which I want to go into a bit detail about later in this session, you'll see I've got two organizations here. This one is in my tenant. This one below it, which is now, of course, I'm doing a live demo, so it's decided to go slow. This one is actually in another tenant, but I am a user in this particular Azure DevOps organization. You will see why I point this out shortly. Anyway, if you have the right permissions, you can change various organization settings in Azure DevOps. A lot of these are intuitive, so I won't go into them too much. But I will, for example, highlight that billing is where you can connect up to an Azure subscription to pay for your Azure DevOps organization. So if you have Azure credit and you go over the amount of users, etc., this can be an option. Microsoft Entra is where you can either connect or disconnect from a Microsoft Entra Active Directory. Some larger organizations require you to disconnect if you are creating your own Azure DevOps organization. So I wanted to highlight that here. The last setting here I will highlight is because I see people ask this question a lot online. So now and again, some of you may go to work in Azure DevOps and realize that you can't create what's known as classic pipelines. So you can't use the classic editor or the nice GUI-based releases feature. And that is because a while ago, Microsoft introduced 2 new settings to disable the creation of these pipelines. So if you can't work on these in your enterprise, this is why. So each Azure DevOps organization contains one or more projects. And if I go into a project, you can see, and I'll expand this with the chevrons. I have to choose for resolution for that if I can get there. Apparently not from now on, but we'll stick to this. So you can see all the default services on the left-hand side. So you have Azure Boards, and this is where you manage your work items. Azure Repos, and I will click on this one. This is where you can see a visual representation of your Git repositories that are stored in Azure DevOps. So the service itself is called Azure Repos. That's one of the services in Azure DevOps. I just want to help people understand a bit of jargon there. So as you can see, there's different parts of it you can visualize, like the commits, branches, etc. So if you want to look at the commit history, you can do it a nice GUI-based way as well. Then you have Azure Pipelines, and this is where you orchestrate your deployment pipelines. In fact, Azure DevOps. Azure Test Plans, and this is where you can create test plans for staff within your enterprise. I must admit, I actually quite like using Azure Test Plans because it removes the need to do it in spreadsheets, and therefore you remove what I call spreadsheet sprawl. It's a terrible thing. Try and use Azure Test Plans. Finally, you have Azure Artifacts, and this is where you can store your packages, your builds, etc., for a long time in Azure DevOps. So, and again, before I leave Azure DevOps, if you have the right permission, you can change various settings here, as you can see, relating to your project. One thing I will highlight here for you all, if you're working with service connections, please give them a nice user-friendly name like I have here. Okay, not entirely user-friendly, my ones, but they're good for demos. Because if you don't give them user-friendly names, you risk exposing sensitive information about your subscription details, etc., when it does its default name. And also, just so everybody's aware, you can click on the marketplace up there and add additional extensions, depending on the company you work for, because they may actually have to approve them. So that is my short and sweet introduction to Azure DevOps. There is a lot of material online that goes into a lot more depth about it, including, if I remember correctly, a previously recorded session from GroupBy in the past that was done. So let's move forward to Microsoft Fabric Git integration. So Git integration, as I tend to shorten it for this session, allows supported items in a workspace to have metadata synchronized with a Git repository. And to be more precise, because I want to make sure everybody's fully aware of this, there is a direct connection between a Fabric workspace, like I showed you earlier, and a branch inside the Git repository. It doesn't connect to the entire repository, just one branch. I will show you this shortly. So the items that are supported at various levels. By the way, data flows isn't supported yet. So for example, Power BI behind the scenes creates Power BI desktop projects as part of these repositories. Data warehouse supports data warehouse projects. So logically, with a lakehouse, you get the lakehouse name. So that's it. So it'll only deploy just a container of the lakehouse with the name for you. If you do any deployments based on what you got stored in a Git repository, I'll show you a workaround shortly. So Git integration supports Azure DevOps and GitHub cloud-based offerings. So whichever one of these you use, you can only use the cloud-based versions. Top tip though, if you have to choose between the two, you can only create an organization for a specific region in Azure DevOps. You cannot create an organization or a repository in the specific region for GitHub cloud-based offerings. You can with GitHub Server, but not with the cloud-based offerings, which are known as github.com. Feel free to reach out to me after this session if you want to see that in black and white. In addition to that, Git integration requires Fabric or Power BI premium capacity. This can be any Fabric capacity, including NF2. So when it comes to configuring Azure DevOps for Microsoft Fabric Git integration, it uses your Microsoft Entra ID authentication. Again, to help with some jargon, this is what was formerly known as Azure Active Directory. That account needs access to both the workspace in Fabric and the repository in Azure DevOps. And you remember earlier, I highlighted the fact that I had another Azure DevOps organization, another tenant. This is why. So the entry user needs to be in the same tenant when you go to configure the connection. However, the Azure DevOps organization does not. So I can have two tenants, tenant A, tenant B. If I have my Fabric tenant deployed in tenant A, but then I create a Azure DevOps organization in tenant B, what I can do is actually add a user from tenant A as a user in the Azure DevOps organization in tenant B, and I'll be able to still do the connectivity. I'll show you this shortly. So there are some security considerations. Try and keep your organization and repository in relevant region if you're looking to use Microsoft Fabric Git integration, because as some of you may know, when working with things like notebooks, sometimes people do things like put access keys in notebooks, even though you really shouldn't. So if they're going to do that, try and keep it at least in the same region, and of course keep your organization private as well, so they're not exposed for everybody. What you can actually look to use is GitHub Advanced Security for Azure DevOps. This is the same feature that's been in GitHub for some time, as the name kind of gives away. This will actually pick up if somebody's done something like put a secret into, for example, into a notebook, like an access key, and it will, you can set it to refuse any pull requests. So I wanted to highlight this. This does come at a cost though, so make sure you read the small print if you're going to use it, because it does backdate all the commits done in repositories as well. So anybody who's done a commit over the last so many days. So now I am going to do a very nice Git integration demo for you all. So first of all, I'll show you how to do it from scratch in a blank workspace. And as you can see, I've imaginatively called it blank workspace. So if we go in the workspace and I click on workspace settings on the top right-hand corner, and I'll make this a bit bigger for everybody. If anybody has any issues with visibility, feel free to put in the chat. I can increase the resolution, I can use zoom it, etc. So here in workspace settings, we go to click on Git integration. And then from there, I have to select either Azure DevOps or GitHub. So if I select Azure DevOps, as you can see, I just get asked for my Entra ID account. I can click on connect, and now I can fill out these details. Now, first of all, organization. Why am I highlighting here? This, if I zoom in, you can see I've got my Azure DevOps organization and another tenant there. This is to highlight the point I made earlier. From there, I can just go down this nice drill through manner to target the specific repository. Luckily, you have a nice search facility as well. So if you're like me and you have a lot of repositories, you can target the one you want and then select my branch. And then from there, I can select connect and sync. at the bottom. Now, I've already done this for, I would say, another repository, but in reality, I've done it for multiple other repositories. So this is the finished result. So if I click on Workspace Settings and GIS integration, you'll see I have all the details I entered there. Plus, I have this new source control button magically appear. If I click on this, I get to do some interesting stuff. So just to help you all realize what happens, if you make a change in a workspace, you'll get a change appear in the Changes tab to say, oh, I see you made a change. Do you want to commit it to the repository? If I was to make an update in the repository behind the scenes, and I can assure you, you will see that in this session, it will tell you you've got an update in the repository that you need to synchronize with the workspace. Now, quick tip here. If you click on the ellipsis and click View Repository, this will take you directly to your repository, like so. So it will take you to your repository, and if you're lucky, like we are this time around, it will keep your resolution settings as well. It doesn't always do that. So it's just a quick tip for everybody. So another thing we can do, if we click, sorry everybody, I should have gone that bit slower there. You can see I've got a little Git branching icon on the right hand side. If I click on there, I can do some really interesting things. So first of all, it shows me related branches. But what it can also allow me to do is select branch out to a new workspace. So here, as you can see in this window, I can fill out some details on what this will do. This will create a new workspace for me. It will connect it to a branch name of my choice in the repository, and it will also synchronize over all the supported items. Now, I want you all to realize it only does this with supported items. So if you've got something like data flows, it won't magically put those over for you. But this is a great way to create feature branches. So that's a very quick introduction to Git integration. Are there any questions? I can't see anything in the chat.
We have some that have come into the Q&A section. So this might be something that you're coming to later on, but I'll just let you know of the question as well. So the question is that when deploying from dev to prod, how do you connect the semantic model to the production lakehouse or warehouse without using Power BI deployment pipelines?
We'll cover this in part, but I don't fully cover the semantic models in this session. This is an hour long. Yeah. If you're using a direct lake semantic model, though, I do have a blog post, and this is where it gets funny with me these days. I have a blog post on how you can potentially do that. I have been informed that potentially in future updates, this may not fully work because it could be a breaking change, but I do at this moment in time have a blog post relating to it. Any other questions in the Q&A? I didn't pop up the Q&A, I popped up the chat. Anyway, so, and I'll put this in the chat here, this link, because hopefully this is, sorry everyone, I was just checking to make sure I actually had the right link to put in the chat for people here, because a while ago, Microsoft actually, there's a link I've just put in. Hopefully one of the moderators will be able to put this somewhere visible for everybody if it's not there already. So a while ago, and it was actually still last month, Microsoft released a document about containing suggested CI/CD workflows. And I will show you this document shortly when we go to do the demos. And it highlights, well, it shows particular ways to perform CI/CD and various options. So to give this document some context for this session, I want to show how you use Azure DevOps with Microsoft's recommendations, because they are, well, not open-ended, but they are not service specific. And I'm going to show you some interesting insights along the way as well. So first of all, Microsoft's got their recommended development process where they say that you either do an update in a feature workspace, or you do an update locally in an IDE. So for example, using a Power BI desktop project that's backed by a Git repository. Don't worry, I'll show you all this shortly. And then you synchronize your change with the feature branch in Azure DevOps. So the Git branch in the Git repository, basically, which you can then synchronize to the main or dev branch, which is fine. But I do propose you take it one step further. If you come, especially if you come from a development background, and if you're used to doing something like unit testing for SQL Server. So as you can see here in this example, I picked on Power BI for this particular example. You could work with a Power BI report, and you can either work with that in a Fabric workspace or in Power BI desktop, and then save it as a Power BI desktop project, which is saved into a folder which is initialized as a Git repository, and then you can synchronize it with the repository stored in Azure DevOps. And then when you go to do the pull request to the next branch, it actually calls a pipeline in Azure Pipelines. And this can be used to do your continuous integration tests, in other words, do your unit tests, etc. Now, I have shown how to do it here with Power BI. The reality is you can do it for other items as well. For example, you can use it to do unit testing on notebooks, lakehouses. You can even use it now to do unit testing with data pipelines. There's a complete data pipeline testing framework available now. And you can find that on GitHub. If you are wondering what all the different unit testing options are, I have a very nice long detailed post about all the different options. So this is just to help you realize that you can do your unit testing here as well. So I'll go through the different release options now, and this will help in part answer some questions that people ask. So the first one Microsoft states is for Git-based deployments. And what Microsoft says is deploy the multiple workspaces with the same Git repository. And you do this by actually configuring them to use different branches. So for example, like I showed you just now, with one workspace connected to a feature branch and one workspace connected to a dev branch in the same repository. And then you can do pull requests between the two to do the updates, etc. Like you can see in this diagram here. Now, I already done it for one workspace. The reality is you could do this for multiple different workspaces that represent different environments, like your standard development test acceptance production environments, also known as DTAP. So if anyone ever says to you DTAP, that's what it stands for, by the way. Then there's option 2, and this is to deploy the different workspaces using Azure pipelines. And Microsoft recommends that each workflow contains a build and release process. So a build for your unit tests and a release to perform the update. I find the wordish a bit interesting because for me, from a DevOps background, I tend to shift left and do my unit testing as early as possible in the process, but not repeatedly. Of course, it's up to some personal preference and what capacity you're using as well. I mean, by all means, look to do unit tests if you need to for the different environments. Just bear in mind that is going to impact your capacity and maybe over excessive for your needs. One thing I will note here is that only Power BI items are supported if you use service principals for API calls at this moment in time. So I see Douglas has joined us. So next up, so here's a diagram just to show how it works. So it's similar to how we showed development processes already. But what Microsoft says, when you've done your pull request to your main branch, could be another branch name, then actually run the pipeline to deploy the update. So a typical way to do this is by calling APIs. So I have some recommendations if you're going to do this. So first of all, I say consider YAML pipelines here. I highly recommend YAML pipelines instead of the classic pipelines. For a start, you cannot do pull requests on classic pipelines. In other words, YAML pipelines are very flexible. If you create a YAML pipeline, those YAML, one or more YAML files are stored then in that repository you're working on, which means if you take that repository and you move it somewhere else, all you have to do in Azure pipelines is reconnect up those YAML files. If, on the other hand, you use the classic pipelines with the nice clicky GUIs, that's great until you move your repository. And then you've got to recreate all those clicking activities. And there's some security concerns as well. Microsoft has a document relating to this. So I recommend looking to use self-hosted agents. This is Azure Pipeline self-hosted agents, by the way, so that you keep your workload secure. You can use some Microsoft hosted agents. They are supposed to be for one-time use, but if you want that extra peace of mind, use your own ones, and you can customize them as well. Please look to use variable groups and Azure Key Vault. Now, you can use variable groups to store variables you're going to keep constantly repeating. You can also store your secrets in there as well. Just I recommend keeping them secret, but also I actually recommend storing your secrets in Key Vault instead. You can link your variable groups to Key Vault, or you can call Key Vault secrets using tasks in Azure DevOps. Please do not store your secrets directly in your pipelines, because you do not know where your repositories are going to end up. And those secrets will stay in your history, even if you remove them and do a commit. And if you're going to use Azure pipelines, you might as well go the whole, as I say, 9 yards. Implement an approvals process as well for your more sensitive environments. This could be your production environment. For some of you, it will be your acceptance and production environments. And you can do this with YAML pipelines with environments. With the release process, it's just a nice clicking way of creating a release gate. Anyway, third option, deploy using deployment pipelines in Fabric. So what Microsoft recommends, and as I showed you just now, where you can go to update a workspace that represents a development environment, Microsoft is saying do that up until that development workspace. And then from there, use deployment pipelines in Fabric. Now, deployment pipelines are not new to Microsoft Fabric. Those of you with a Power BI background, these are the same deployment pipelines you've worked potentially with in the past. They've been around for quite some time. And Microsoft's saying, yep, just go up to that stage, and then for the other stages, use the pipeline. However, you can also create your deployment pipeline stages, take advantage of the features, etc., of deployment pipelines, and then actually orchestrate the deployments using Azure pipelines instead. And there are some really good advantages to doing this, and I will show you some in a minute. So to help visualize Microsoft's recommendation, this is the typical up to the dev workspace we've been talking about up until now. And then for the rest of it, Microsoft is saying, just go and do deployment pipelines. However, if we did the alternative with Azure pipelines, we can implement that approval process. But that's not all that we can do, because we can include a bit of data ops as well if we orchestrate the deployment with Azure pipelines instead, like this diagram shows. So yes, by all means, use Azure pipelines to start doing the deployments. And once you've updated a certain workspace, what you can do from there is actually called a notebook to start deploying your lakehouses. Now, if you remember when I said earlier about lakehouses, the only information that's stored in Git integration is the contained lakehouse name itself. To populate it, you have to do some data ops, and this is one way you can do it. Just to manage expectations at this moment in time, you cannot use a service principal to call the API to run the notebook, though. You have to think of an alternative until service principals are supported, which I personally am hoping will happen in the very near future. But it's just to help you all realize this is option. Finally, Microsoft go to option 4, and this is for basically people that have multiple clients. And what Microsoft is suggesting are you do development and test work in the different workspaces in your own tenant, and then do the deployment to the workspaces that are in your client tenants using Azure pipelines. This is just a very quick diagram to highlight all this. So as you can see, technically, it's not much different from their release option 2. The only caveat is that this time you're going off to deploy the production in other tenants. So as you can see, I have got some nice demos for you all now. Just checking the time, I'm actually doing quite well for time. So let's do first of all, Power BI desktop projects. I have a report in Power BI. And what I've done, and you don't have to squint everybody, I will zoom in here. I go to options and settings, select options. I have the window come up. Usually when I'm not online, it's a bit faster than this. Click on preview features. And as you can see, I've actually selected Power BI project and Tyndall format options. In case anybody was wondering, I have not selected PBIR because if I selected PBIR, I would break the entire demo because PBIR, when you save it from Power BI desktop, does not work too well with deployment pipelines. Just a bit of a device for you all there. Once I've done that, and once Power BI decides not to jump context, I can then save as a PBIP file. And what that actually really does, it saves an entire folder format, not just that file. So if we go into, so when you create a Power BI desktop project, that PBIP file, it deploys, it saves certain folders. So the first one is obviously that PBIP file. That's just a pointer to say, yep, you've got a project. It also saves by default when you save it in Power BI desktop, a folder that represents the metadata of your report, and another folder which represents your semantic model. Now, you may remember that I selected, I'll make this a bit bigger to get landscape here, I selected the new Tyndall format, which means that I get all these nice user-friendly Tyndall files here. So I have, and what I actually do as part of the demo, I should actually show you what happens when I save it. So I'm going to do that now. So I'm just going to change this report name. I'm going to change the page name. Don't have to worry about seeing it all. I'm just going to save it because you'll soon see when I've done that change, you'll see in Visual Studio Code that I've had the change recognized. I go to source control. Because I've already initialized a folder that the Power BI project is in as a Git repository, I can now commit my change. How with some jargon, harden the change. If you haven't got it as a Git repository already and you open the folder in Visual Studio Code and go to source control, you'll get a button like this, but it's say initialize repository. Anyway, just going to say here quickly, change page name. Now, what I've done with this particular repository, I've synchronized it with the repository I've got for Git integration in Azure DevOps. So what I can do, if we go back into Azure DevOps now, and I hit refresh, you can see it says, just now I done that change because it's been synced. We happen to be conveniently in the right workspace to do this. So if I do a refresh now in this feature workspace, which is linked to the same branch you just saw in Azure DevOps, you'll see that the change is there. So when I open this up, it says, yep, you've had an update done in the repository. Do you want to update? I'm going to go for yes. Now I have a separate workspace, so, and if I go, yeah, thank you. If I go to workspace settings, get integration, and I zoom in, you'll see I'm connected to the dev branch. So as you probably realize, it means that the report's got the old name. So what I can do, and because Azure DevOps recognizes there's a change, I can do what's known as a pull request. A pull request is basically me asking for permission to merge the changes from one branch to another. So I'm asking to merge from the feature branch in my repository to the development branch. Click on create. And when that starts running, you will notice I've actually got a pipeline running. Remember I mentioned earlier, you can do some continuous integration. Well, this is what you can do. And I can do this because of my branch. If I go to my dev branch, I've got what's known as a branch policy set up. And this branch policy says, and I'll make this a bit more legible here, that every time I want to do a pull request, I want to run a pipeline first. So this pipeline is running. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, what it does. Microsoft has a document detailing it all. But the short version is that first of all, it downloads Tabular Editor and the default best practice analyzer rule set. Then it actually runs the Tabular Editor CLI on the Azure Pipeline Agent against all those nice Tyndall files I showed you earlier, just to see if there's any issues with the semantic model. And then it does a similar thing for the actual report itself and checks the PBIR file using PBI Inspector. I do have some blog posts relating to this as well, by the way, everybody. I do appreciate these are very fast demos for demonstration purposes. So if we go back now to my pull request, you can see it's completed, no serious issues found. So I can approve and then complete. And then from there, I can just complete my merge. And that will merge my updates in my feature branch to my dev branch. So that means now if I press F5 in my workspace that represents the development environment, you'll see source control again says there's an update. I can just click on update all and that update is done. So that's how you can update to multiple workspaces using Git integration. Now, I have a deployment pipeline set up. And this particular deployment pipeline has the development workspace I showed you just now, or the workspace that represents a development environment, as the development stage in my deployment pipeline. So for those of you yet to see it, this is how a deployment pipeline looks even, tongue tied there, in Microsoft Fabric. So as you can see, if I want, I can just click on deploy and that can deploy everything. I can cherry pick items and then click deploy if I want to. Depending on what I'm using as a source, for example, for my semantic model, I can put in some deployment rules in place. By the way, those of you studying for the DP600 certification may want to pay attention to some of these points here I've just made, etc. So I can do this in a nice GUI-based manner. However, I can also, as I mentioned earlier, orchestrate it fully in Azure DevOps. As you can see here in the classic release pipeline, you can see I can deploy nicely from test to production. So I click on a task. All I'm doing is authenticating on the Azure Pipeline Agent and then running a PowerShell script that I've got saved in the same Git repository. By the way, that PowerShell script is openly available by Microsoft. Also, that does kind of remind me, if you are interested in the document from Microsoft, and I did put it in the chat earlier, I do believe this is the site to look for. So in addition to doing it with classic pipelines, you can, of course, do it with a YAML pipeline as well. I won't go into it too much, and I overclick there. So this is just a YAML-based version of what I showed you just now, but this is my preference if you're going to work in Azure DevOps, YAML pipelines. I know it can seem a bit hard to get used to, but you get an assistant, etc., to help. As I mentioned earlier, you can actually take this further as well. And you can actually look to run a notebook to populate a lakehouse, as I've done here. And as you hopefully you just saw in the history, that actually did work. So if I look at releases, you can see, for example, here, it did run and populate it. Now, actually, what I can quickly show you is we've got 9 minutes. I've quickly got time. So what I can show you what it actually did. I have a notebook here. I do have a verbose blog post on this, but I'll quickly show you all what I've done. If I zoom in, what I essentially do is download a GitHub repository that Microsoft have made available. I then extract the contents of one of the CSV files in that repository into a data frame, and then scroll down here. Then I write the contents back into a new CSV file. Just to show this works for everybody, if I go to my test workspace and I click the right test workspace and not the one for the data warehouse test, if I go to the lakehouse, as you can see here is that CSV file from that run pipeline. So before this session, I actually did completely remove the lakehouse and then went through all again, just to make sure this definitely works for you all. So that is how you can do all those different types of deployments. And that leaves me now a bit of luxury of time to talk about CI/CD for data warehouses. And this is where some of you can see some T-SQL. So when you're working with data warehouses in Fabric, you can connect to it externally by using the connection string, which allows you to do deployments at data warehouse through traditional CI/CD methods, including state-based migrations, which is where you use what's known as a database project to create or build a DAT pack, which you can then deploy updates to one or more data warehouses. Or you can do migration-based, and this is where you can run a set of scripts. If you are going to use migration-based, check your tooling, because there may be some potential issues using the more popular ones with a data warehouse. So Fabric supports database projects created in a number of places. I'll show you a couple in this session. I have a more verbose blog post I did last week that lists a whole load of different ways to do it. And you can do CI/CD with an Azure DevOps pipeline, just like you've been able to do over the years for SQL Server databases, Synapse SQL pools, etc. Now, here's a diagram of one typical way that you can perform CI/CD for a data warehouse. So you can update the database project locally, synchronize your change, and then Azure pipelines can actually create the DAT pack. And that's your continuous integration side, the CI part, and then that DAT pack can be deployed, and that's your CD. There are other ways to do it as well. I should highlight, you can, for example, directly extract the contents of one data warehouse and deploy the schema, and only the schema, not the data, important point to remember, to another data warehouse. Now, after quickly going through all of that, I have a demo for you all. So here, in fact, let's first go to Fabric instead to give this a bit more context. So I have here a warehouse in Fabric, and I'm just going to quickly open it up in Warehouse Editor. Make the resolution a little bit better. Nope, I will actually change it again because I need to highlight something here. So two things I want to highlight. First of all, as you can see, if I zoom in, you can immediately download the SQL database project in Warehouse Editor now. Once you do this, you get a nice zip file you can extract and do what you want with it. Also here, to get the connection string, you click on settings. Now, it's not that I don't trust you all. However, I'm not going to expose my connection string for my data warehouse during this particular session. So once I've got my connection string, I can connect up to it using any external tool. And the reality is it's the same external tools you could have used in the past to connect up to, example, Azure SQL Database. I'm using Azure Data Studio. It's easier for demo purposes. Now, in Azure Data Studio, I'm using an extension called SQL Database Projects. This now gives me some interesting options. So, for example, I can connect up to my data warehouse in Azure Data Studio. I can right click and select Create Project from Database, fill out this nice, easy, intuitive screen. It will create a database project for me. When you look at database projects through the extension, you get this nice manageable database project in Azure Data Studio. And then, for example, here, what I can do is right click and do manage, because what I want to show you, if I change target platform, I just want to show you all this because not everybody's aware. You can change to all the different, what they call target platforms, including, people don't realize this, Fabric mirrored SQL databases as well. So just so everybody is aware, that's now an option. Anyway, if I go to Explorer, you'll see the database project is actually a collection of files, just like Power BI projects. And you get a SQL proj file with it. Now, I want to make you all aware there's two types of database projects. There's the original one, which people have used for many years, and the SDK style project. The original one will list every single SQL file used, which is fine, but really bloats out your project file. The new one doesn't. It does what's known as the SDK style one, uses something called globbing. It will just identify all the SQL files in your database project for you. Anyway, this particular project, I set up in source control. It's already initialized as a Git repository and synchronized with one in Azure DevOps. In fact, this one is synchronized with, I've got 3 minutes to finish this amazingly fast demo, which is fine because I'll show you why it's fine. So this is connected up to a repository. This repository I can then use in a pipeline if I want to. So for example, if we go to a classic pipeline, just to highlight here in the classic pipeline, I can build the dat pack, basically create the dat pack file based on the contents of that database project. Once that is done, I can then look to actually deploy it to one or more databases. Now, the reason I'm fine with doing a very short version is because I have some very verbose blog posts that show you how to do this for either classic pipelines or YAML pipelines like I show here. If you use the YAML pipelines one, what you can do, find this section and download the template, because then you don't have to get too much to grips with the YAML I showed you. I also have a separate one for those who are keen on doing it with GitHub Actions, but not to worry. So that is a very short demo on how you can do CI/CD for data warehouses.